So I've seen a lot of videos that basically say, if you can answer these questions, you're this level. And if you can answer these questions, you're this level. You've probably seen these too. The problem is that the questions are usually just multiple choice grammar questions, not questions that check your ability to speak and understand people in real situations. And this is important because your ability to communicate is the main thing that actually determines your level, not your knowledge of grammar. So, I'm going to help you find out what your real level is. First things first, when we talk about language learning, we usually use something called the CEFR, which is a system that has 6 levels from A1 to C2. In this video, I'm going to very quickly explain what your language should look like at each of those levels. For example, what you should be able to do at each level and how easy or difficult it should be. This way, instead of taking a test that doesn't actually measure your ability to communicate, you can just say, oh, that level sounds like me. That's probably my level. And this will be much more accurate than a multiple choice test because this is what the CEFR was actually designed to measure. Also, although the CEFR does assess reading and writing, in this video we're focusing primarily on speaking because your ability to speak and have conversations is generally the best indicator of your real level. So, let's begin. The first level, A1, is what we typically call beginner. At this level, you can make very basic sentences, but you usually need time to think before speaking. You can probably say things like, "Where is the bathroom?" "How much is this?" "I don't understand." And "I like coffee." At this level, you can understand very common words and phrases, but you probably need people to speak very slowly. However, if you can understand everything I'm saying right now, you're probably not A1, so let's go to A2. A2 is what we often call pre-intermediate. At this level, you can talk about your daily life and you can use English in simple everyday situations. However, your sentences are still simple and it's not easy for you to explain things in detail. And it's difficult for you to reply to questions that you've never been asked before. So you can probably say things like, "I work in a Thai restaurant 5 days per week." "I'm going to see a movie this weekend." "Where did you get that?" And "What time did you wake up this morning?" At this level, you can usually understand people when they speak clearly and use simple language. However, even when people speak slowly and use simple language, you still might need to ask them to repeat things sometimes. And listening to natural speech and real conversations is still usually very difficult. B1 is what we call intermediate. At this level, you can have real conversations and deal with most everyday situations. However, depending on the topic, some conversations might feel quite easy while others might be quite difficult. For example, you might feel really good about your English when going shopping or ordering food at a restaurant. But talking about topics like politics, AI, or social media is probably quite difficult. Basically, you can communicate pretty well in everyday situations, but you sometimes make mistakes, you sometimes need time to search for words, and you can't always explain complex ideas clearly. At this level, you can understand me most of the time because I speak quite clearly, but fast or more natural speech is still probably quite difficult. The next level, B2, is what we call upper intermediate. At this level, you can speak quite fluently and express your ideas in detail, even when talking about more complex topics. Overall, you can communicate really well, but you sometimes say things that sound a bit unnatural. And you still make occasional grammar mistakes, especially with more difficult things like passive voice or past perfect tense. At this level, you can understand most of what you hear in daily life, but things like news programs or very fast speech might still be a bit challenging. And although your everyday vocabulary is now excellent, you do sometimes need to check the meaning of words when discussing topics that you're less familiar with. C1 is what we call advanced. At this level, you can speak very fluently, expressing your ideas clearly and in detail. Your speech usually sounds very natural, and you can communicate easily in both social and professional settings. However, you occasionally use words or phrases that work but aren't really the best or most natural choice for that situation. At this level, you can understand almost all of what you hear. However, very fast speech or unfamiliar accents might still be difficult sometimes. And when conversations become very detailed or technical, you may still need to ask for clarification or check the meaning of specific words. The final level is C2, and at this level, your English is very close to a native speaker's. You can say everything you want to say, you can say it easily, you can say it naturally, and you can say it in detail. However, you might sometimes miss things like humor, technical language, things related to culture, or small differences between very similar words. Now, let me very quickly summarize that for you. At the A1 level, you can communicate a tiny bit, but only about very simple topics. At A2, you can have basic conversations, but only with simple language, and you need the other person to speak slowly. By B1, you can have conversations about lots of different topics, but not with lots of detail, not perfectly, and not always easily. At B2, you can have conversations pretty easily, but you still occasionally struggle with things like grammar and vocabulary, especially when talking about more complex topics. At C1, you can use English very easily, even in professional settings. However, you occasionally say things that are just a tiny bit unnatural. And you might sometimes have difficulty understanding very fast speech or unfamiliar accents. And C2 basically means that you're an expert, but there are still really small things that occasionally remind you that you're not a native speaker. So leave a comment and let me know what you think your level is. And if you've ever taken a multiple choice level test, also let everyone know what level that gave you.